The teapot lid wasn't the only thing missing. A Miss Marple puzzle. The silver teapot sat on the conservatory tray with the confidence of an object that had always been admired, and it was a good 2 minutes before Miss Marple noticed what was wrong with it. The lid was gone. Not misplaced, not fallen behind the tray cloth or rolled to the edge of the table. Gone, as decisively as a word crossed out in ink. The hinge that ought to have received it was bare, and the opening at the top of the pot gaped in a way that no proper tea service should. The steam that had long since stopped rising, leaving only the faint ghost of warmth in the silver itself, which Miss Marple touched very briefly with 2 fingers before withdrawing her hand. She stood in the conservatory doorway for a moment, taking it in. And the conservatory at Hollowmere House smelled of damp earth and cut flowers, and underneath both, something else she couldn't quite place, something pressed and dried, the way old paper smells when a drawer has been shut for a long time. The late April light came through the glass in long, flat angles, landing on the tea table, on the empty chairs, on the tray with its missing lid, and on a teacup to the left of the pot that held still the dregs of something that had been drunk about halfway down. She had been in the garden when Constable Hicks came through the French doors calling for Dr. Marchmont, who was already there, standing with his black bag at his side in the particular posture of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of news, and found, now that it had arrived, that he did not know what to do with his hands. And Miss Marple had not gone with them to the writing-room. She had no reason to, not officially, not in the way that Inspector Price would have a reason, or Dr. Marchmont, or even Julian Vane, who was Cordelia's stepson, and therefore the next of kin, however complicated that was. Miss Marple had a reason of a different sort, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply keeps the feet still and the eyes moving. She looked at the teacup again. The saucer beneath it held a small linen square, folded once, which was how Cordelia had always taken her tea. She disliked the feel of cold china against her fingers. Reverend Pettigrew had mentioned this. Or perhaps Miss Marple had simply noticed it herself in the 40 minutes they had all sat together. Before Cordelia excused herself and did not come back, the cup had been used. 1 person. 1 cup from a tray that had been set for 6. The others had taken theirs into the garden, or to the far chairs by the fern stand, or stood with them in the way that people stand at affairs like this one, politely, with their weight on 1 foot, pretending that a charitable tea does not feel exactly like an examination. Cordelia had stayed at the table. She had poured for herself and drunk half, and then gone to the writing-room. And that was the last any of them had seen of her. Miss Marple had arrived that morning on the 10:15 from Maidstone, which was not, strictly speaking, the most direct route from St. Mary Mead. But Reverend Pettigrew had met her at the station in his elderly Ford, and driven her to the vicarage, where she was to stay for the week, and over cold mutton and a great deal of tea. He had told her what he knew. "She's been receiving letters," he said. He had a long, worried face that had been long and worried for so many years that one no longer noticed it as an expression, only as a feature. "Anonymous ones since February, perhaps earlier. What sort of letters? That's the strange part. They're not threatening. No demands, no accusations written out, nothing of that kind, just notes, she called them, a sentence or 2, and inside each one a dried flower." Miss Marple had set down her fork. "What kind of flower?" "A violet," he said, "each time, the same pressed flower, or the same variety of it." Cordelia said they smelled of nothing by the time they arrived. Dried right through. He paused. She was frightened, Miss Marple. Not of the letters themselves, she said, but of what they might mean, as if someone was trying to tell her something without being able to say it plainly. That was the word that had stayed with Miss Marple on the drive to Hollowmere House, violet, as the Ford rattled along the lane between hedgerows and the light dipped in and out of cloud. Violets in February meant someone had been keeping them from last spring, pressed and saved and enclosed in envelopes one by one over months. That was not a threat. That was a kind of careful, frightened patience. Hollowmere House was a solid Georgian building with too much ivy and not enough paint on the window frames. The sort of house that had been handsome once and was now merely large. The drive was well kept. The gardens were not. Cordelia Vane had been a widow for 8 months, and the gardens showed it, not neglected exactly, but unattended in the way of things that were being maintained by habit rather than affection. The roses pruned because they had always been pruned. The lawn cut because it had always been cut, but no new planting, no new beds, nothing that said someone was thinking about next year. Miss Marple had noticed Julian Vane's car in the drive before she noticed Julian himself. A dark green Humber, not new, with a dent in the rear left panel that had been there long enough to rust slightly at the edges. Julian was standing at the edge of the lawn with a cigarette, when Reverend Pettigrew brought Miss Marple round through the side gate, and he nodded at her with the careful courtesy of a man who has been told to be on his best behaviour and resents the instruction. He was 33 or 34, she thought, in with his father's jaw and none of his father's ease. Sir Rowland Vane had been, by all accounts, a man who wore his authority lightly, who made people feel settled rather than assessed. Julian had the same broad frame and the same dark colouring, and gave the impression of someone wearing a coat that had been made for someone else. "Miss Marple," he said, "good of you to come." "I was glad to," she said. "How is your stepmother?" Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not grief, not dislike, something more like the expression of a man trying to remember what the correct feeling was. "Bearing up," he said. They went inside, and Miss Marple had met the others in the conservatory over the next half hour. Honoria Bligh at the far end of the room with a teacup she kept forgetting to drink from, her grey eyes following Cordelia with an attention that looked like worry, and might have been something else. Adela Crewe, near the fern stand, a small, sharp-featured woman of about 60, who had arrived uninvited the night before from Bath, according to Reverend Pettigrew, and who stood with her cup very close to her chest, like a shield. Dr. Marchmont near the French doors, affable and deliberate, the kind of man who fills a room without appearing to try. Cordelia herself had been quieter than Miss Marple had expected. Not the grief quiet of the recently bereaved, which she'd had 8 months to move through, but a different kind, the quiet of someone holding something. A thought, a decision, a piece of knowledge newly arrived. That had not yet been told to anyone. She had poured tea for her guests with the pearl brooch at her collar catching the light, and she had spoken the right words to the right people, and she had smiled at Reverend Pettigrew's small joke about the weather, and she had not quite met Miss Marple's eyes. Not once, not in 40 minutes, Miss Marple had noticed. She noticed most things, and the things she didn't notice immediately she noticed later, when she was looking at something else. Now she stood in the conservatory doorway, with the voices from the writing-room coming to her in fragments. Constable Hicks's careful official tones. the sound of Dr. Marchmont's bag being set down on a hard floor, and she looked at the tray on the table, at the teacup with its half-drunk contents, at the bare hinge of the teapot where the lid had been. And she thought about a woman who had recently ordered reading spectacles for the first time in her life, who had never liked reading, who had spent the last week very quietly going through something she had not been able to read properly before. She thought about violets. She thought about what Reverend Pettigrew had said, as if someone was trying to tell her something without being able to say it plainly. Someone had been afraid to speak. And now Cordelia Vane, who had perhaps finally heard what they were trying to say, was dead in the writing room, with a teacup half drunk beside her and no lid on the pot. Inspector Price arrived at 4:30. Miss Marple knew him by reputation only, a careful man, Reverend Pettigrew had said, which in Miss Marple's experience meant a man who collected facts the way some people collected postage stamps, neatly, in rows, without always understanding what the pictures meant. He came through the front door with a sergeant at his elbow and went straight to the writing room. And for 20 minutes Hollowmere House held its breath. The guests had been moved to the drawing room. Someone had thought to bring the tea tray in from the conservatory, which Miss Marple thought was either very practical or very unfortunate, depending on what was in the cup. She sat near the window with her knitting bag open on her lap, and her needles not yet moving, watching. Julian stood at the fireplace with his back to the room. Adela Crewe sat on the small sofa near the door, with her hands folded and her eyes on the carpet. And there was something in the set of her shoulders, a drawn-in, braced quality, like a person waiting to be told something they have already guessed. Miss Bligh had taken the chair nearest the tray and was pouring tea for no one in particular, filling cups that nobody came to collect. The small domestic motion of her hands entirely at odds with the stillness of her face. Dr. Marchmont stood by the window on the far side of the room. He was looking at the garden, or appearing to, his reflection faint in the glass, and Miss Marple, watching that reflection, thought that he was not seeing the garden at all. Reverend Pettigrew had gone to telephone the churchwarden and had not come back. Miss Marple took out her knitting. She was working on a pair of bed socks in pale yellow wool, the left one nearly finished, and then she let the needles find their rhythm before she said anything at all, because in Miss Marple's experience, the best time to ask a question was when the person being asked had stopped expecting one. "Miss Bligh," she said conversationally, to the room in general and to Honoria Bligh in particular. "How long were you with Sir Rowland altogether?" Miss Bligh looked up. She had a long face, not unpleasant, and her grey eyes were composed in the way of someone who has spent many years being composed on behalf of other people. 11 years, she said, since 1941. That's a great loyalty. He was a good employer. And Mrs. Vane has kept you on? It wasn't quite a question. Miss Bligh's hands paused on the teapot handle. She was kind enough to, she said after a moment, in a tone that suggested kindness was perhaps not the only word for it. Julian turned from the fireplace. "Honoria has been invaluable," he said, in the flat voice of someone repeating a line they've said before, and no longer believe. "She knows where everything is, every document, every deed. Father relied on her completely." "And you?" Miss Marple asked him. "I beg your pardon. Did you rely on her as well?" Julian's jaw tightened slightly. "I wasn't much involved in the estate while Father was alive." "No," said Miss Marple, and returned to her knitting. The fire had been lit, though the afternoon wasn't cold enough to need it, someone's instinct toward comfort overriding reason, and the room smelled now of wood smoke and the dried flower arrangement on the mantelpiece, to tight-bunched chrysanthemums that had been there long enough to go papery and begin to drop. Underneath those smells, very faintly, something pressed and sweet, the kind of smell that attaches itself to things kept in drawers. Miss Marple's needles paused. She looked at the mantelpiece. Among the chrysanthemums, barely visible, a small piece of folded paper had been tucked into the arrangement near the base of the vase. It was the size of a correspondence card, cream-coloured, and it had been there long enough that one edge had begun to curl from the warmth. She did not reach for it. Not yet. Not with 4 other people in the room, and Inspector Price somewhere down the hall, building his tidy rows of stamped facts. "The letters," she said, still to the room, still in the same light tone, "that Mrs. Vane received. Did any of you know about them?" A silence. Not the silence of people who hadn't heard, but the silence of people deciding how much they'd heard. Adela Crewe's hands tightened in her lap, the knuckles pulling slightly white, and then relaxed again, deliberately, the way you relax your hands when you've noticed someone watching them. "Letters?" Dr. Marchmont said, turning from the window. His voice was easy, professionally easy, the voice he used when asking patients to describe a pain he'd already diagnosed. "What sort of letters?" "Anonymous ones," said Miss Marple. "Since February." "I didn't know about any letters," Julian said. "Nor did I," said Dr. Marchmont. He came away from the window now, took the chair that Miss Bligh had left empty when she moved to the sofa, and crossed one leg over the other with the comfortable authority of a man in his mid-50s who has always found chairs accommodating. "Cordelia didn't mention anything of that kind to me." Miss Marple looked at Miss Bligh. Honoria Bligh was looking at the fire. Her profile was very still. She had the kind of stillness, Miss Marple thought, that comes not from calm, but from long practice at appearing calm, the way a house can look perfectly ordinary from the outside while every room inside it is in the process of being quietly rearranged. "Miss Bligh," Miss Marple said. "I knew," she said to the fire. "She showed me one, in March." A pause. She didn't know what to make of them. What was in it? Honoria Bligh turned then, and looked at Miss Marple directly, with grey eyes that had something in them besides composure, something tired and a little frightened. "3 sentences," she said. "I don't remember them exactly. Something about Sir Rowland, about how he had died." Another pause, shorter, and a dried flower inside the fold. "A violet," said Miss Marple. The word landed in the room in a particular way. Adela Crewe made a small sound, barely audible, the sound of someone who has just touched something hot and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. "Yes," said Miss Bligh, watching her, "a violet." It was Dr. Marchmont who spoke next. "You're not suggesting," he said pleasantly, "that someone was accusing Cordelia of something? In an anonymous letter?" "That's rather. I'm not suggesting anything," said Miss Marple. "I'm only asking what was in the letters." She looked at Adela Crewe. "Mrs. Crewe, you arrived last night. Uninvited, I understand. It was that connected to the letters at all?" Adela Crewe looked up. She was a small woman who had once probably been pretty, in the sharp-featured way of women who know exactly what they think. And she still had that quality, the directness of it, though it was muted now by something that looked very much like fear. "I came," she said carefully, "because I was worried about Cordelia." "Had you been in correspondence with her?" "A bit, in a manner of speaking." "Yes or no, I think, would do." Adela Crewe looked at her for a long moment, and Miss Marple looked back, and her needles kept their rhythm, click and turn, the yellow wool drawing through her fingers with the patience of something that has been doing this a long time. "Yes," said Adela Crewe, very quietly. Julian turned from the fireplace again. "What does that mean? Did you send her those letters or not?" "Julian," said Dr. Marchmont, in the tone of a man smoothing something over. "No, I want to know. If someone was sending Cordelia anonymous letters, and it turns out it was some cousin from Bath—" "She was frightened," Adela Crewe said, and now her voice had a steadiness to it that hadn't been there before. The steadiness of someone who has decided that being frightened of a thing is less bearable than saying it. "I was frightened. I didn't know how to—" She stopped, looked at Dr. Marchmont, looked away. "I thought if she understood what I suspected, she would be careful. I thought a letter was safer than—" She stopped again. "Safer than speaking," Miss Marple thought. Safer than saying a name in a room where the named person might be present. She looked at the mantelpiece again, at the folded paper half hidden in the dried flowers. She thought about the violet variety that grew in only one garden in Little Ambleside, not at Hollowmere, and about a woman in Bath who had been frightened since, at the very least, February, frightened enough to press flowers and fold paper and address envelopes and post them one by one across 3 months without signing her name. Someone had been trying to warn Cordelia, and Cordelia, finally, had understood. She had gone to the writing room with that understanding, and she had sat down with a half-drunk cup of tea, and she had written down a name. Inspector Price appeared in the doorway. "I'll need to speak to each of you," he said, looking at the room with his careful, stamp-collecting eyes. "One at a time, if you don't mind. Mr. Vane, shall we start with you?" Julian straightened, followed him out without a word. Miss Marple looked at Adela Crewe, who was looking at her hands again, and at Miss Bligh, who had gone back to her careful stillness, and at Dr. Marchmont, who was examining the bookshelves with the mildly interested expression of a man who had nothing whatsoever to hide. Her needles did not stop. Miss Marple went outside while Inspector Price was with Julian. Nobody stopped her. Nobody noticed, or if they noticed, nobody thought an elderly woman with a knitting bag walking into a garden was worth remarking on, which was, as Miss Marple had found over many years, one of the more reliable advantages of being exactly what she was. The air outside smelled of recent rain and turned earth, and the particular sharpness of an April garden that has been rained on twice in a week and is now considering what to do about it. The lawn ran south from the conservatory terrace in a long, slightly uneven rectangle, and at its far end the garden divided, a path going left toward a kitchen garden behind a low wall, and another going right, through a gap in the yew hedge, toward what the house agent's particulars would have called a water feature, and what was, in fact, a circular ornamental pond about 8 feet across, ringed with flat stones, with a small stone urn at its centre, from which nothing currently flowed. Miss Marple took the right-hand path. She walked slowly, which was natural and also useful, because walking slowly through a garden after a death gives one time to look at things. And Miss Marple was looking at the ground, and the path was gravel, fine and well raked, and it had been rained on, and it showed footprints. Several sets overlapping, impossible to read individually. The conservatory guests had presumably wandered out during the tea. The day had been fair enough for that. But at the edge of the yew hedge, where the gravel gave way briefly to a strip of bare earth before the pond path began, There were 2 prints very clearly. A man's shoe, size 10 or 11, with a leather sole, the heel deeper than the toe. Someone had stood here and looked toward the pond, or come from it. Miss Marple looked at the pond. It was empty of anything interesting on its surface. Flat grey water with a skin of pollen and 2 early flies describing slow circles near the urn. She crouched with some difficulty and looked at the bottom. Stones, flat, pale stones on the pond bed, the kind that occur naturally along stream beds, rounded and smooth, and among them, quite clearly, a glint of silver. She did not put her hand in. She straightened again, slowly, and stood with her hands folded over her knitting bag, looking at the silver glint and thinking about it. The lid had been weighted. Someone had taken the teapot lid from the conservatory tray, carried it out here, and put it in this pond with a stone on top of it. Not thrown it, not dropped it in a hurry. Placed it the way you place something you mean to stay where you put it, at least for a while, at least long enough. She thought about that walk. From the conservatory, across the terrace, down the lawn, through the yew hedge to this pond. In both directions. The person who had done this had walked it twice, once to put the lid in the water, and once to come back. And they had done it at some point during the afternoon when the other guests were in the conservatory or the garden, when nobody was watching the pond path specifically. Or they had done it earlier. Before the tea, before the guests arrived. Miss Marple stood very still and listened to the garden. A wood pigeon somewhere in the yew hedge. The sound of a car on the lane beyond the wall. From inside the house, faintly, the sound of Inspector Price's deliberate voice. She turned and took the left-hand path, through the kitchen garden gate, and walked the length of the vegetable beds to the far wall, where a door stood open onto a service lane. This pond, the kitchen garden pond, was smaller, tucked in the corner between the wall and the cold frames, fed by a drainpipe, used for watering. Brown water, not ornamental. No flat stones on its bed. 2 ponds. She had known there were 2 because she had noticed the garden from the upstairs landing window, when Reverend Pettigrew brought her through the house on arrival, and she had the habit, in any house she visited, of understanding its geography before she needed to. The way you check where the exits are before the theatre begins. The ornamental pond was the one that was shown to visitors, the one that appeared in the garden plan framed in the hallway, the one that a person who knew the garden well would know about. The kitchen pond was not on the plan. She walked back through the kitchen garden and latched the gate behind her and stood on the lawn for a moment, looking up at the house. Dr. Marchmont had arrived early. She knew this because Reverend Pettigrew had mentioned it, casually, in the ford on the way over. In the way that people mention things they don't know are significant. Felix was already there when I arrived, he'd said. Walking the grounds, he said. Settles his nerves before a gathering. Miss Marple had filed it without comment. She filed most things without comment. Walking the grounds to settle his nerves. On a path that passed the ornamental pond. She looked at the yew hedge gap, and then she looked at the conservatory windows, and she thought about what could be seen from one and not the other. Nothing was the answer. The yew hedge hid the pond path completely from the conservatory. You could stand at the pond and not be observed from the house. You could equally stand at the pond and not observe the house. What you would need to choose that pond over the kitchen pond was prior knowledge. She turned her attention to the garden's boundary wall, specifically the section nearest the lane, and there, in the bed against the wall, growing in a long, ragged stripe between two old rose bushes, she found what she had been half expecting to find. Violets. Not here. This was not what she'd expected. These were common dog violets, the ordinary kind growing wild in the way they do in gardens that have let a corner go. Viola riviniana, she believed, though she was not a botanist, the sort that seeds itself from a neighbouring garden and becomes established without invitation. They were past their best now, the flowers small and closing, but they had bloomed here, clearly, in the last several weeks. She crouched again and looked at them carefully, and she thought about what Reverend Pettigrew had told her, that the variety in Cordelia's letters grew only in one garden in Little Ambleside, and not at Hollowmere. These were not that variety. She knew the difference because she had seen on the drive-in through the village a garden at No. 2 Marsh Lane, with a front bed blazing with Viola odorata, the sweet violet, the old-fashioned kind with the scent that carries 20 feet on a still day, deep purple and thick-stemmed, the sort that someone's grandmother had planted, and that had been there ever since. The sort you pressed because they kept their colour and their shape and, for a while, their smell. No. 2, Marsh Lane. She would need to know whose garden that was. She stood and brushed the earth from her fingers and looked once more at the wall bed, and then at the house, and then she heard the conservatory door open and looked up to find Adela Crewe standing on the terrace, watching her. Not with surprise, with the look of someone who has been watching a thing develop and is now watching it arrive. Miss Marple walked back up the lawn toward her, unhurriedly. "You found the pond," Adela Crewe said. It wasn't a question. "I found both of them," said Miss Marple. Adela Crewe looked at her for a moment, and then looked away, over the garden, over the yew hedge, toward the invisible ornamental pond, and whatever was glinting at its bottom. Her face in profile was tight with something, guilt or grief, or the particular exhaustion of a person who has been frightened for a long time and is very tired of it. "The violets," Miss Marple said, "the ones in the letters, but they came from Marsh Lane." Adela Crewe said nothing. "That's your garden, I think," said Miss Marple. "Or it was, or you know whose it is." A long pause, the wood-pigeon again, the far sound of the car on the lane, the house behind them holding its breath. "It's mine," said Adela Crewe. "I rent the cottage. I've been in Little Ambleside since November." She paused. "I didn't tell Cordelia I was here. I thought it would be safer for both of us if she didn't know exactly where the letters came from." She stopped. "I was wrong about a great many things." "Yes," said Miss Marple, not unkindly. "I'm afraid you were." She looked at the house again, at the conservatory windows, at the drawing-room beyond where Dr. Marchmont was waiting with his bookshelves and his pleasant expression. Her needles were not in her hands, but the counting continued regardless. Inspector Price let Miss Marple into the writing-room at 5:20. He didn't want to. She could see that in the way he positioned himself in the doorway when she asked, his body making the unconscious argument that the room was a police matter, and she was a visitor from St. Mary Mead with a knitting bag. But Reverend Pettigrew had said something to him privately in the hallway, and whatever he'd said had produced a short silence, and then a step to one side, and Miss Marple had gone in. The writing-room was small. It had been a morning room once, she thought, before someone had put a desk in it and a bookcase, and called it something more purposeful. The desk faced the window, which looked onto the side passage between the house and the garden wall. Not a pleasant view, brick and drainpipe, but a private one. Nobody overlooked it. Cordelia was gone now, taken away with the careful efficiency that death requires, but the room held the shape of what had happened in the way that rooms do. The air still and dense with it, the chair slightly pushed back from the desk at the angle it had been pushed when someone's weight left it suddenly and did not return. The smell in here was different from the conservatory. Old paper, strongly. The dry, dusty smell of documents that have been stored and unstored, and underneath it something faintly medicinal. Not unpleasant, the way a doctor's waiting room smells, or a dispensary. Something astringent that had been here long enough to settle into the walls. Miss Marple stood just inside the door and breathed it in, and her needles turned once, twice, and in her fingers, without her noticing, she'd picked them up. The desk had been cleared by the police, or mostly cleared. A blotter remained, green leather, with the faint ghost of ink transfers on its surface, reversed words she couldn't read. The pen tray was empty. The small brass lamp had been moved to one side. What was not there was what interested her. No spectacles case. Cordelia had collected her new reading spectacles 3 weeks ago, according to the optician in the village, which Miss Marple had learned from the Reverend Pettigrew, who had learned it from the optician's wife who attended St. Crispin's, and considered most information the rightful property of anyone who needed it. The spectacles were new, the first Cordelia had ever owned, ordered in late February, collected in early April, and they were presumably somewhere in the house. But not here, on the desk where she had been reading. Not in the writing room where she had sat with documents spread before her, and a half-drunk cup of tea cooling beside her, and a name somewhere in the process of being written down. The sergeant, a young man with a notebook, was standing near the bookcase looking slightly uncertain. Miss Marple addressed him. "The papers on the desk," she said. "Were they taken into evidence?" "Documents were bagged, yes, ma'am." "All of them?" "Everything on the desk surface." "And the wastepaper basket?" The sergeant looked at the wastepaper basket, which was wicker, small, sitting beside the desk leg, and which was empty. "Bagged as well. Was there much in it?" A pause, the kind where a young man is deciding whether answering a question constitutes a breach of something. "Torn paper," he said finally. "Several pieces. Looks like one sheet torn up small." Miss Marple looked at the wastepaper basket for a moment, and then at the desk, and then at the chair pushed back at its particular angle. Someone had written something, and then torn it up, and then no, not in that order. She thought about it differently. Cordelia had come to the writing room with a purpose, had sat down, had taken out or located papers she'd been reading through, estate documents, account books, correspondence, the things that a newly spectacled woman might spend a week going through with the quiet concentration of someone who has decided it is time to understand what she owns. She had been reading. She had found something, and she had begun to write it down. Not a letter, not yet. Something more preliminary than a letter. A name, a figure, a note to herself about what she'd found. The kind of thing you write to make a thing real. To transfer it from the uncertain territory of suspicion into the more solid ground of words on paper. And then she had drunk her tea, and she had died, and someone had come in here after and torn up what she'd written. That was the sequence. Miss Marple looked at the blotter again, at the ghost words reversed in the ink transfers. and thought about what a document examiner could do with a blotter, and what Inspector Price probably already knew, and what he hadn't yet told her. She turned to the sergeant. "The teacup," she said. "Has it been sent for analysis?" "Yes, ma'am, both cups. The one from the writing room and the one from the conservatory tray." "Both cups. Good." Price was careful then, whatever his limitations with the stamp collection. "And the teapot?" "Sent as well, without its lid." The sergeant looked at her. "Constable Hicks found the lid," he said, "in the ornamental pond, waited." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I know." She looked around the room once more, slowly, the way she looked at things when she was trying to understand not what was present, but what was missing. The spectacles case, the written name, the lid, all the absences arranging themselves in her mind like gaps in a sentence that give you the word that belongs there. She went back to the drawing room. Julian was there again, standing at the fireplace again, in the same position, as like a man who had returned to the only spot in the room where he knew what to do with himself. His cigarette was new. His face had changed, though. The careful courtesy was gone. In its place was something raw, less managed, the face of a man who had been in a room with Inspector Price for 40 minutes, and had come out knowing he was the primary direction of suspicion, and who was, underneath his anger at it, not entirely surprised. "They think I did it," he said to the room. To nobody, to Miss Marple, because she was the one who'd come in. "Do they?" she said, and sat down. "I had motive enough, apparently, the will, the estate." He drew on the cigarette. "As if I'd waited 8 months and then poisoned her at a charitable tea. People have done stranger things," Miss Marple said, "though I agree the timing is odd." He looked at her. "You don't think I did it?" "I don't know who did it yet," she said honestly. "But you're right that the timing wants explaining." She paused. "You said earlier you weren't much involved in the estate while your father was alive. Was that by choice or by exclusion?" Julian was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Outside, a car door closed. The police surgeon leaving, she thought, or arriving. "Both," he said finally. "We didn't get on. Not for a long time." He looked at the cigarette. "We'd actually, in the last few months before he died, we'd begun to talk properly, for the first time in years." He stopped. He was going to change the will. "He told me so. We were drawing it up with the solicitor. But he died before it was signed." "Heart failure," Julian said flatly, and the words worn down to their surface by months of use. 8 months ago. The new will unsigned. The old will valid." He paused. "So yes, I had a motive. Cordelia had the estate. Now she's dead, and it comes to me anyway." He looked at Miss Marple directly. "Which is either very convenient or very obvious, depending on your view of me." "Or both," said Miss Marple mildly. He almost smiled at that. Didn't quite. Across the room, Adela Crewe had come back in from the terrace and was sitting on the small sofa with her hands still folded, but differently now, not braced, not shielding herself, the hands of someone who had made a decision out in the garden and was waiting to act on it. Miss Marple caught her eye and held it for a moment, and Adela Crewe gave a very small nod, barely perceptible, had the nod of someone confirming something they'd already agreed to. Good, Miss Marple thought. She would talk. When the moment was right, she would talk. Dr. Marchmont came in from the hallway, where he had apparently been speaking with Inspector Price, and the room rearranged itself slightly around his entrance, the way rooms do around people who have always been comfortable in them. He went to the fire, nodded at Julian, accepted a cup of tea from Miss Bligh with the ease of a man receiving something that was owed to him. "Price is thorough," he said to Julian in a reassuring tone. "He'll sort it out." "Will he?" Julian said. Not a question. Miss Marple watched Dr. Marchmont's face as he said it. He was looking at the fire. His expression was the expression she had been watching since 4 o'clock. The mild, settled expression of a man with nothing to hide. And it was exactly that quality that had been bothering her. Not the expression itself, but its steadiness, its unchanging quality through every shift of the afternoon, through the news of Cordelia's death, through the arrival of the police, through the conversation about the letters in this very room, through all of it, not numb, not shocked, not grieving, not even particularly watchful. Simply the same, the expression of a man who had known since he arrived that morning and walked the grounds to settle his nerves, that this afternoon was going to go in a particular direction, and had prepared his face accordingly. She looked at his shoes. Black leather, good quality, size 10 or 11, with a leather sole. She looked at the heel. Then she looked at the fire again, and picked up her knitting, and counted to herself, not stitches. It was Honoria Bligh who broke first, and she broke quietly, the way things break that have been under pressure for a long time. Not a crack, but a slow giving way, like a seam that has been pulled at one thread for months, and finally releases the whole length at once. Miss Marple found her in the upstairs corridor at 6:30. She had come up on the pretext of retrieving her second ball of yellow wool from her coat pocket, which she had left in the guest bedroom, when Reverend Pettigrew's housekeeper had brought her things over in the afternoon, and she had found Honoria Bligh standing at the window at the corridor's end, looking out at the garden, at the long early evening light lying flat across the lawn, and the yew hedge and the invisible pond beyond it, her arms crossed over her chest in the posture of someone holding themselves together by main effort. Miss Marple came and stood beside her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The garden below was empty now. The police had finished with the pond, and the flat stones at its edge had been photographed, and the lid retrieved and bagged, and the pond itself was just a pond again, grey water and pollen and 2 flies, holding no particular expression. "You knew about the accounts," Miss Marple said. Not a question. Honoria Bligh's breath came out slowly, as if she'd been holding it since February. "Yes," she said. "For how long?" A pause, the length of a genuine calculation. 2 years, she said, perhaps a little more. Sir Rowland's private accounts, the trust accounts, the estate management funds. Money going out in amounts too regular to be mistakes, and too irregular to be salary. She stopped. "I kept the books. I would have had to be blind not to see it. And you said nothing." Honoria Bligh's jaw tightened. "I had nowhere to go," she said, in a voice stripped of everything except the plain fact of it. "I'm 53 years old. I've been a secretary since I was 22. I have no family of any consequence, and no savings of any consequence, and no qualifications beyond what I've spent 30 years doing in other people's offices." She paused. Dr. Marchmont was a trusted friend of the family. Sir Rowland trusted him with everything, the estate accounts, the medical trust, the investments. If I had accused him and been wrong, or if I had accused him and been right and not been believed. She didn't finish it. She didn't need to. Miss Marple looked at her profile, at the long, composed face that was not composed now, and thought about what it cost a person to know a thing, and carry it in silence for 2 years, sitting across a desk from it every day, filing its letters and scheduling its appointments, and watching it smile at the man it was quietly ruining. "Sir Rowland found out," Miss Marple said. "I think so. In the last few months, he became," Honoria Bligh chose the word carefully, "preoccupied with the accounts, asking me for figures I'd already given him, comparing columns, staying late. He didn't say anything to me directly. He was the kind of man who worked things out alone first, and spoke only when he was certain." She paused. "He never got to be certain. He died, and Cordelia ordered reading spectacles in February." Honoria Bligh turned from the window now and looked at Miss Marple fully, with her grey eyes that were tired and a little red at the rims, and older, somehow, than her face. "She told me she wanted to go through Rowland's personal papers, the ones he'd been working on before he died. She said she couldn't make sense of the figures, and she thought it was her eyesight." A pause. "I knew what she would find. I knew, and She stopped. "I should have warned her more plainly. I should have gone to the police 2 years ago." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "you should have." It was not said cruelly, but it was said plainly, because Honoria Bligh was not a woman who needed softening, and because the truth of it was the truth of it, and acknowledging it was the only thing left that she could do for Cordelia Vane. Honoria Bligh nodded once, accepting it. "The name she wrote down," Miss Marple said. "The paper that was torn up. I don't know what was on it, but you know whose name it would have been." "Yes," she said, "I know." They stood in the corridor a moment longer, the evening light moving on the wall, and then Miss Marple went back downstairs. Adela Crewe was waiting for her in the morning room, which was the small room off the hallway that was not the writing room and not the drawing room, but the third alternative that houses like this always provided, the room nobody used for anything in particular, and everyone retreated to when the rooms with purpose became unbearable. She had made tea somehow, found the kitchen and the kettle and 2 cups, and done it herself with the self-sufficient air of a woman who had been living alone in a rented cottage since November, and had stopped expecting other people to perform small tasks on her behalf. She poured without asking and pushed a cup across the table. Miss Marple sat down and picked it up, and thought briefly and practically about the fact that she was drinking tea in a house where someone had been poisoned through tea that afternoon, and decided that Adela Crewe had made this tea herself from a kettle she had filled herself, and that the calculus of trust, while not absolute, was sufficient. She drank. "The violet letters," she said. "Tell me what you knew." Adela Crewe wrapped her hands around her own cup. She had the directness now that she'd only briefly shown in the drawing-room, but the quality of a woman who had been frightened into indirection for months, and was finding her way back to her own voice. "Rowland wrote to me in October," she said, "a month before he died. We were close, as children, he and I, second cousins, but we grew up in the same house for a while, after my mother died. He trusted me." She paused. The letter was strange, not alarmed, not accusing anyone, but puzzled. He said he'd found discrepancies in accounts he'd been reviewing. He said he wanted a second opinion from someone outside the household. He asked me to come in December, when he could show me properly. But he died in November. Yes. A short word that carried a long weight. Heart failure, the death certificate said. Dr. Marchmont attended him through his illness and signed the certificate. I came to the funeral. I looked at Marchmont across the grave, and I thought— She stopped, pressed her lips together. I had no proof. only a dead man's puzzled letter, and my own instinct, which is not the same thing. So you came back in November, rented the cottage. I needed to be near enough to watch, and far enough to think. She looked at her cup. I sent Cordelia the letters, because I couldn't tell her directly. Not without evidence. Not with Marchmont in and out of this house every week, trusted completely, attending to her health as he had attended to Roland's. A pause. I used the violets from my garden because I wanted her to be able to find me if she understood. If she asked around the village about where that variety grew, she would have found me. But she didn't ask. She didn't know she needed to. Adela Crewe's voice caught slightly. Oh, and she controlled it. The last letter I sent 2 weeks ago was the plainest I'd dared. I said that Roland had not died of his heart. I said that the person who attended him was the person who had reason for him not to recover. I said she should be very careful what she ate and drank in company. She set her cup down. I said it, and I couldn't sign my name to it, and I kept thinking that if Marchmont intercepted a letter with my name on it, if he realized how close she was to understanding. She stopped. He didn't intercept the letters, Miss Marple said, but he came this morning and walked the garden to settle his nerves. And at some point during the afternoon, he found a way to be near the tea tray, and the lid of the teapot went into the ornamental pond. Why the lid? Miss Marple considered this, because it was a question she had been considering since she first noticed the bare hinge. I think, she said slowly, because whatever he put into the tea was in the lid. A small compartment, or a preparation applied to the inner surface, something that would dissolve when the hot liquid was poured and the lid was in place and then removed from that water by the pouring. She paused. I'm not a chemist, but the foxglove preparations that would mimic heart failure are water-soluble, and a lid placed on a pot of very hot tea for 5 minutes would do a certain amount of work. She paused again. He used the same method on Sir Roland, most likely, over many months, in smaller doses. Enough to weaken. Enough eventually to stop. Adela Crewe was very still. And the lid in the pond, she said, to wash it. To wash it, or to remove it from the scene. He didn't expect anyone to find it so quickly. He probably intended to retrieve it after dark. Miss Marple looked at her cup. But he put it in the wrong pond. Adela Crewe frowned. Wrong pond? Hollowmere has 2, Miss Marple said. The ornamental one, which is on the garden plan in the hallway, and the kitchen pond, which is not. Dr. Marchmont has been a visitor to this house for 30 years. He has been in the drawing room, the dining room, the library, the conservatory. He has walked the formal garden. But I would be very surprised if he has ever had occasion to go through the kitchen garden to the service lane. She paused. The ornamental pond is the pond a visitor knows. The kitchen pond is the pond a resident knows. She left the rest of it where it was. Adela Crewe understood it. He gave himself away by knowing too much, she said. He gave himself away by not knowing enough, Miss Marple corrected, not sharply, just precisely. There's a difference, and it matters. She stood and straightened her cardigan and picked up her knitting bag. I think, she said, that it's time to speak to Inspector Price. Inspector Price listened without interrupting, which was either a sign of respect or a sign of a man reserving his objections for the end, and Miss Marple suspected it was both. She had asked for 10 minutes with him in the morning room, and Adela Crewe had left them to it, taking her tea and her directness back to the drawing room, with the quiet tact of a woman who understood that the next part of this was not hers to perform. Miss Marple sat across the small table from Price and laid it out for him, not dramatically, not in the manner of a drawing-room revelation, with everyone assembled and the murderer going pale in the corner, but plainly, in the way you explain to a careful man the thing he has almost arrived at himself, and needs only the last piece to complete. The 2 ponds first. Price already knew about the pond. He had the lid in a bag, and he had a constable who had spoken to the gardener who confirmed that the ornamental pond was the one shown to visitors, and the kitchen pond was not. He had not yet connected this to the question of which pond a 30-year visitor would know, and which he would not. Miss Marple connected it for him, and watched him follow it. The shoes second. She described the print at the edge of the yew hedge, the depth of the heel, the size. Bob Price looked at his sergeant's notes, and found that the sergeant had measured and photographed the print, but had not yet compared it to the footwear of the people present. He would do so now. The spectacles case, third. This one gave Price a moment's pause. He had not noticed its absence from the writing room. Miss Marple explained what it meant, that Cordelia had been reading in that room, carefully, with the new spectacles she had only recently acquired, and that the case was not there because someone had taken it, not as evidence of anything except that Cordelia had been reading, but because a spectacles case on a desk tells a story about what a person was doing at that desk, and the person who came into the writing room after Cordelia died had thought to remove it. "That's a very small detail," Price said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. It is. That's what makes it interesting." Price was quiet for a moment. "The torn paper in the wastepaper basket," he said. "What did your document examiner make of the blotter?" A pause, which told her that the blotter had been sent but not yet examined. "We'll expedite that," he said. "I think you'll find a name," she said, "or the beginning of one." She had just worked it out, you see. She wasn't writing a letter to the police, or a formal accusation. She was writing it down for herself first, the way you write a thing to make it true. And then the tea did its work and she was gone. And he came in and found what she'd written and tore it up, and took the spectacles case. And that was the last thing he did before he came back to the drawing room and stood at the bookcase, looking at the shelves with that very pleasant, very steady expression. Price looked at her across the table. "Dr. Marchmont," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. Another silence, longer, the kind where a careful man is weighing what he has against what he needs, and calculating the distance between them. "The tea analysis will take 2 days," he said. "I know. The blotter perhaps 3. Yes. In the meantime, I have a dead woman, a missing lid, a footprint, and the testimony of an elderly lady from St. Mary Mead about which pond is on the garden plan and which isn't." He said it without hostility, which she appreciated. "You also have Honoria Bligh," said Miss Marple, "who has been carrying the knowledge of the embezzlement for 2 years, and is, I think, now ready to speak. And Adela Crewe, who has Roland Vane's letter from October, asking her to come and look at the accounts, which she has kept." She paused. "She should have given it to you this afternoon. She'll give it to you now." Price looked at her for a long moment. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been knitting," said Miss Marple. "It's remarkable what people say when you're knitting." They arrested Dr. Marchmont at 8:20 as he was leaving. He had said his goodbyes in the drawing-room with the same ease he'd brought to everything else. Handshakes for Julian, a word for Miss Bligh, a professional murmur to Adela Crewe about making sure she ate something this evening. And he had collected his black bag from the hallway table and was halfway down the front steps when Price came out after him. Miss Marple watched from the drawing-room window. She watched Price say something, and watched Marchmont stop walking, and watched the stillness that came over him. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a man who has known, somewhere underneath the pleasant expression, that this moment was the direction everything had been moving since 4 o'clock, and perhaps longer, perhaps since October, when Roland Vane wrote a puzzled letter to a cousin in Bath, perhaps since long before that, since the first time he opened a private account and moved a small, careful amount into it and told himself it was temporary. He didn't protest. He turned and he looked back at the house, not at Price, and for a moment his face was entirely without the expression it had worn all afternoon, and what was underneath was not guilt exactly, not remorse exactly, but something older and more tired than either. The face of a man who has been managing something very heavy for a very long time, and has, at last, put it down. He went with them quietly. Miss Marple turned from the window. Julian was in the chair by the fire, the cigarette gone, his hands open on his knees in the posture of a man who has had a great deal of tension. Leave him at once, and is not quite sure yet what to do with the space it leaves. Across the room, Adela Crewe and Honoria Bligh sat at opposite ends of the sofa, in the careful proximity of women who don't know each other well, but have spent an afternoon being afraid of the same thing, and are now, tentatively, in the same country. Reverend Pettigrew had come back. He was sitting near the window with a cup of cold tea and an expression of exhausted sadness, and the expression of a man of faith confronting the specific grief of wickedness that has been going on for years in a place where he thought he knew everyone. Miss Marple sat by the fire. She had found her second ball of yellow wool, and she worked on the bedsock, the left one nearly finished, the needles finding their rhythm in the warm and smoky air. And she let the room settle around her, the way a room settles after something has broken and the pieces have been acknowledged, and there is nothing left to do but sit with it. "He was my father's oldest friend," Julian said to the fire. 30 years. Nobody answered, because there was no answer to give. "He sat with us when father was ill. He came every day," he stopped. "I thought he stopped again. "He was perhaps many things," Miss Marple said. "People usually are. That's what makes it so difficult." Julian looked at her. "Does that make it better?" "No," she said. "It makes it true, which is different." The fire settled, a log shifting, sending up a brief scatter of sparks that died before they reached the chimney breast. Outside, the last of the light was gone from the garden. The ornamental pond would be dark now, flat and lightless, holding nothing but water and the memory of what had been placed there and taken away. Miss Marple thought about Cordelia Vane. She thought about a woman of 52 who had spent 8 months in a large house managing a grief she didn't entirely understand, who had ordered spectacles in February because she had decided it was time to see clearly, and who had spent 3 weeks reading through her dead husband's papers, with the careful attention of someone who suspects they have been missing something important for a long time. She thought about the pearl brooch at her collar, catching the light. She thought about the violet letters arriving since February, each one a dried flower and a few careful sentences from a cousin in a rented cottage 2 streets away, too frightened to sign her name, too decent to say nothing. Cordelia had understood finally. She had gone to the writing room, and she had begun to write it down. And the tea had already done its work by then. The hot liquid poured through a doctored lid, the preparation dissolving, the damage already done before she lifted the cup, and she had died in a quiet room, with a pen in her hand and a name half written on a piece of paper that someone else would tear into pieces small enough to mean nothing. Almost nothing. The blotter would give Price what he needed, the accounts would give him more. Roland Vane's letter to Adela Crewe would give him the timeline. Miss Bligh's testimony would give him the years. It would be enough. It was a sad enough word, enough, not justice exactly, not restitution. Cordelia was still dead, and Roland was still dead. And 30 years of friendship had turned out to contain, running through it like a dark thread through pale cloth, a greed that had started small and been fed slowly until it required silence, and then required more than silence. Miss Marple's needles turned. She thought about something Mrs. Arkwright had said once. In street, Mary Mead, after they'd found out about the solicitor. Mrs. Arkwright had sat in Miss Marple's parlour and said very quietly that the worst part wasn't the money. The worst part was that she had trusted him so completely that she had never looked, and that not looking had felt, at the time, like faith. Cordelia had trusted Marchmont the same way. She had never looked at the accounts because Marchmont managed them, and Marchmont was a friend. And then Roland died, and she was alone, and she ordered spectacles in February. And she looked, and she found what was there to find, and she died for it. Reverend Pettigrew set down his cold tea. "Will it go to trial?" "I expect so," said Miss Marple. "And he'll—" "Yes," she said, "almost certainly." A silence. "I keep thinking," said Adela Crewe from the sofa, to no one in particular, "that if I had simply knocked on the door, come to her directly, in November when I arrived, instead of the letters, instead of the violets, if I had simply—" "You were frightened?" Miss Marple said. "Yes. So was she. So was Miss Bligh." She paused. "Fear makes people very inventive about reasons not to speak. That isn't a criticism. It's just what fear does." Adela Crewe was quiet for a moment. Then, "The violets will come again next spring, in the garden at Marsh Lane." She said it as if she needed to say something that was not about death, something that continued regardless. They always do. Miss Marple looked at the fire. Wickedness, she thought, was rather like a missing lid. You didn't always notice it was gone until you saw what it had been concealing, until the heat of things began to work on what was inside, and the damage became apparent, and you understood that the absence you'd overlooked had been, all along, the whole point. She said this to no one. She kept it where it had formed, somewhere between the firelight and the yellow wool, and the clicking of the needles. And she sat with it, the way she sat with most things, in the knowledge that understanding a truth and being comforted by it were not the same thing, and that one could hold both without pretending otherwise. The bedsock was nearly finished. Outside, little Ambleside settled into its ordinary evening. Somewhere on Marsh Lane, a garden held its violets closed against the dark, patient, waiting for morning. Miss Marple knitted on,